All right, we'll get started. I've already just heard yet again that the session doesn't appear on the mobile app, so I'm not quite sure where people would turn up tomorrow, which was the original slot for this. So what I want to talk about today are system-level questions dealing with identity and the threats associated with identity. So we're going to step back a little bit and take a look at what goes on at a system-level perspective when we think about the kinds of challenges that we're dealing with. And traditionally, we used to call this stuff system thinking. These days, if I say system thinking, somebody thinks I'm talking about a server that's sitting in a room somewhere. System thinking was originally this concept of, hey, what if we look outside of the point-to-point kind of connections and think about what are the implications of other stuff that's going on? And so part of the idea here is to see if we can come up with some ways of dealing with what's a pretty interesting challenge right at the moment. So everywhere we look, my digital identity is kind of the basis for everything that goes on, whether it's scheduling my kids' school activities, whether it's an appointment with my dentist, whether I'm dealing with questions like, can I get access to my Social Security payments or my tax return or anything else. We're at this point now where we have governments dramatically and actively moving to take my identity and put it online in a way that allows me to access their services. And that's one of the sets of behaviors we've been seeing in the UK over the last 4 or 5 years. The reasons are actually really clear. They're economic. I can't afford to actually continue to operate government in the way that we have previously, as it turns out, for various reasons. Folks like the UK said, hey, basically we're out of money. We have to do something that's a little more dramatic at this point. So the only way to handle that was to go to digital identities. The problem is that everything that we look at in this space indicates that the effects on the use of digital identities are all really, really, really bad. So for example, over the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen that the impact of chip and pin. Everybody got a chip and pin card now? You should all at least have one, right? There's always chip and signature as it is in the US. Horrible concept. The impact of chip type cards has dramatically changed the fraud loss associated with transactions in a physical context. Over that same period of time, online transaction fraud has gone up 140%. And so nothing that we're doing at the moment seems to actually impact this stuff. So there's a whole range of questions here about, well, why not? And how would we actually think about changing the problem space if we were going to do something about that? So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of ways in which your identity may go wandering off, and at 2 a.m. in the morning in New Orleans, who the hell knows where your identity is, except that probably you don't want it photographed. So let's take a look at the classic account reset pattern. This occurs almost everywhere, this universal kind of perspective which says, damn, I forgot my password again. I probably do this like 6, 8, 10 times a week, right? The process that we go through normally says, hey, we're actually going to get an email at some point from whatever service provider we're trying to interact with. That will have a link that'll take us to a website where we get to fill in hopefully at least the current password and then the new pass that we actually want to reset to at some point. This is classic, it works everywhere. But when you step back and think about this from a system perspective, here's the challenge. If my email provider has been subverted, then I actually have a problem with the communications path that's being used and assumed to be correct and is the basis of how I establish all of my trust in the rest of this transaction. Now, the 2 ways that we do this almost universally is we'll use either email or we'll use SMS. And one of the messages you should have gotten over the last 2 years from folks like Google, et cetera, is SMS is turning out to be a much less comfortable mechanism than we'd previously expected. So we're seeing multi-factor authentication mechanisms over SMS are actively being and successfully being attacked. We see various providers like Twilio that actually allow me to create virtual mobile numbers that are almost indistinguishable from real ones. Anybody who thinks you can just do a lookup and say, hey, this falls into a good or bad block, knows nothing about the way that this stuff gets distributed. So there are a whole bunch of problems that are occurring here, and this is fundamentally a challenge with the communications path. So whoever thought about the fact that your email provider is actually part of your identity ecosystem? So the challenge we have, or your mobile operators, so some level it's like, well, of course, we tend to think very narrowly about the way that identity ecosystems are defined. We have identity providers, relying parties, and a bunch of other stuff that's in there. But these are the issues that are actually beginning to dramatically affect us. This stuff takes place every day. So the concept of what we're calling cascading identity attacks, where I can actually take over some part of the ecosystem and use it to leverage something else, is now becoming a really, really common part of the equation in this space. So occasionally people say to me, well, if I'm protecting a really, really valuable resource, then what I need to do is actually use a strong multi-factor authenticator, and now everything will be fine, right? FIDO will solve this problem for me. So my question to the FIDO folks out there is, what happens when my FIDO authenticator drops out of my back pocket into the toilet and I need to get a new one? Two issues here. The first one is I have to communicate the fact that that's happened, and secondly, they need to arrange to get me one somehow. Well, guess what they'll probably do? They'll use an email or an SMS message. So we have a bunch of these kind of fundamental threats and challenges that occur within the ecosystem, where ultimately, in many, many cases, what I'm relying on or expecting is the overall trust associated with my system devolves to the question of, is my mobile operator or my email provider actually giving me sufficient coverage, because everything else is depending on them. So now we start to see issues and reasons why, well, maybe this is how come my email is going to vanish. So whatever the mechanism we're using associated here, this is becoming something of a challenge. So the question we asked when we started a concept here called shared signals a while back ago was to say, look, what if the email provider could say, we think that the email address that you're currently using is suspect. Not guaranteed to be taken over even, but at least suspect. And they could say that to the set of folks that actually are going to be dependent on those email addresses. Then we actually have a dramatic chance to kill this kind of fraud. And this is actually a huge percentage of what's going on in the space around dealing with email-based password attacks right at the moment. Just using a fairly simple indicator or alert of the fact that there's a problem occurring here, in this case with my email, this would make a dramatic difference in the way that we're actually looking at this space. So let's take a different example. Breaches are tending to be a major, major challenge for us right at the moment. So let's assume that you're a CISO that actually has a board that funds you. You're able to go and build out the most amazing system that you could ever possibly come up with. You have edge protection, you've got data loss prevention, you've got firewalls up the wazoo, you do red, blue, green testing mechanisms, you have all of the stuff that you've built, and you are being lauded as one of the most amazing CISOs in the industry because you've built this incredible security system that protects your environment. Well, down the road, the other CISO doesn't get much money and is not actually very good at building his security systems, and this is actually what his system looks like. So instead of everybody finding that there are well-defined and really effective security environments, now we find that some of them are really, really spotty. Well, why do I care? Well, it turns out that when we look at pragmatically how we deal with identities in any of these really large systems, we have some issues that we have to deal with. I used to run identity at Google, and one of the challenges is namespaces are really, really hard, particularly when you're building up millions or billions of identities, right? So what's the namespace that we use for our usernames? Almost everywhere. In this case, it's an email address, right? Now, it could be anything, but we've kind of settled on email address. This is a different problem to the first one. The first one we saw was a channel problem. Now what we're going to look at is the question of a namespace and the fact that we're all tending to universally use this namespace. So my challenge here is that Phil Coulson here is running around, turning up at all of the various Shield facilities, and he uses the same password at all of them. Now, at some level that could be called single sign-on, but in the case of passwords, it really kind of isn't. The challenge is that if I have a breach, and my database here is broken open, all of the same usernames that are being used in other places are still being used. And by the way, every user in general, 60% of them, are actually using exactly the same password in every single place. So what happens now? Well, back in the environment where I have this amazing, secure environment, all of a sudden, I have a whole range of identities that are being presented to me that are completely valid. So really large-scale attacks based on good usernames and good passwords, and all of a sudden, this is not very secure anymore because all of the stuff that I'm depending on at a really low level is suddenly not working at all well in this space. So the challenge here is to say, look, we are actually building up this identity ecosystem where we have lots and lots and lots of entities. It used to be you could stand up here at CIS or the RSA conference and you talk about the identity ecosystem, and it was a little bit like learning economics. You had like a two-party or a three-party economic model. There was an IDP and a relying party, and we talked about the wonders of single sign-on across these sorts of things. And then we started adding a few more bits. Now we have a whole range of components that are in this place. We have identity vetting services, we have fraud risk services, we have attribute providers, we have attribute exchanges, we have authentication providers, we have, as well as IDPs, RPs, and everything else that goes on. And now we have this really, really complex environment where, frankly, most of them are not even in my compliance zone. They're not running for me at all. And our challenge in the identity space right at the moment is we have an enormous set of activity that's going on system-wide, and we have no idea what's actually happening. How many of you ever have opened up an email in Google and seen an identifier that says, or a warning message that says, we think this email may be bad, and that it's possibly a spammer that's actually trying to attack you? Has anybody ever seen one of those? Well, how does that work? Well, Google's running a whole bunch of risk-based stuff, which is actually, they're really good at, frankly. Both they and Facebook are some of the most effective identity providers in the world. What they've found out is that by looking at the usage and behavior patterns and content of the email, that there's a problem here. Does Yahoo, if the email will be merged at Yahoo, does Yahoo ever actually get to find that out? That the origin of this email now is potentially suspect. So again, the challenge and the opportunity in all this space is, what if we could actually start to share some information that was actually relatively small and lightweight, that would actually allow us to understand what was going on from a system perspective? So we created a model about 4 or 5 years ago called the shared signals model that we've been talking about and slowly kind of getting some understanding of over the last few years. And we've learned a few things along the way. There are a bunch of different ways that you can handle shared signals. If you saw the panel yesterday or the talk from Microsoft, direct point-to-point kind of communication between companies is a useful thing to do, and we're seeing a bunch of that take place. Generally only the really big guys, though. And so while it's wonderful that Google and Microsoft can share something, I'd actually kind of like my bank to be in that loop as well. And it turns out that if you're a company that runs 6 billion identities like Microsoft, it's really hard to get them excited about managing hundreds of thousands of companies that have a few million identities. It's just really difficult. So we basically said, look, there's probably a clearinghouse model that seems to make sense here. So this is the way that we view a clearinghouse. So there are various arguments, pros and cons about, is one more effective than the other, but here are some of the values that we actually get out of a clearinghouse in the way that we actually build the model. The first one is, we're actually really interested in ensuring that only the minimum amount of information gets shared. So in our model, we don't even actually know that you're a real person sitting behind us. We deal at an account level, and we leave it up to the folks like IDPs or RPs to know who it is that actually owns the account associated with this. So we step right back from this and say, well, let's just ignore all of that and move away from it. The reason for this is it allows us to actually think about limiting the data that we're actually sharing between those accounts in a way that makes us, or puts us in a position where we're actually not only data limiting, but actually very conscious of the personal privacy kinds of constructs that people are moving around the place. So some of the conversation that we saw with Topher's presentation right at the beginning was, hey, what if we could share some signals related to the activities that are going on? These are those kinds of signals. What if you gave permission in order to say, look, I'd kind of really like my bank to know if my email account's about to go sour, because that's kind of bad. So could we set up those kind of arrangements which would allow some minimal data sharing in order to make some value out of this? Then some of the activity and discussion that we had from Andy earlier was a lot about, hey, it'd be great if we could actually move forward and then get folks engaged in sharing this information. The challenge we've found is that while everybody agrees they should do it, nobody does. And then there are a bunch of questions about, well, why is that true? And it turns out that there are a whole range of quite smart reasons. Some of them are business related. So for example, if Google has 50 million account takeovers in a day, they probably don't really want to actually describe that to anybody else. So the way that we set up the model basically says, look, you only get to know stuff about the accounts that are actually related to you. So if you have 50,000 accounts that were affected by the 50 million that Google had taken over, all you get to hear about is 50,000 of your accounts had an issue. All of a sudden, this changes a whole bunch of the issues related to how does a brand that wants to publish this stuff for the goodness of everyone handle this stuff. So they step back and look at that and say, oh, okay, we could handle that. So an example of this kind of mechanism is when we looked at the breach kind of description, right? Somebody gets breached. What if they could say, hey, there is a suspect subject name that exists, and if you'd registered that you actually own or at least manage a bunch of those, you could get a notification which said, maybe you should take a look at the next set of events that occur, or even do something relatively benign like force a password reset on all of those accounts. Now in real time, we could actually be ahead of the curve. Instead of having to wait 6 to 8 weeks, which is about how long it takes for usernames and passwords to turn up on the dark web, you could actually get a jump on this immediately and be aware of the fact that something's about to take place in real time. There's a whole bunch of other kind of values that come out of this. Aggregation of signal recipients. So the big guys would like to deal with just a few kind of entities, so you can set up a trust framework that allows standard agreements about how does information get used and how do you deal with it. If you're a signal recipient, you really want to know that there's a whole range of event publishers out there that you can use, because you've got emails from Microsoft and from Google and from Yahoo and from AOL and everybody else out there, right? You'd like to be able to do that once. You don't really want to have to set up a contract with all of them in order to be able to make that work. Real-time distribution turns out to be really, really important, because part of the opportunity here is that one of the ways to get ahead of that 140% increase in fraud is to think about, are there other ways of dealing with fraud in a way that is actually effective? So this is kind of a view of the way that an online transaction takes place. You log in, you browse around for a while, you check, you fill up your basket, and then you check out. In most systems, where our fraud detection process works is right down in the last few milliseconds associated with my checkout. It's also associated with credit card information. Now, for those of you who haven't had a whole lot of experience, part of the challenge is, although Andy quite reasonably was challenged as soon as he got off the plane, because he's actually a very suspect individual, I have to say, and the banks understand some geolocation information, a whole range of frauds that occur cannot be detected for up to 180 days on your credit card. The reason is we have this wonderful concept called chargebacks and a whole range of other issues that go on that actually mean that we have very, very not fresh information that we're trying to deal with. If we could actually generate some lightweight alerts and we could base some fraud detection on identity rather than credit cards, as soon as we now detect who you are in the context of a transaction, we could actually start to ask interesting questions about your behavior or what's been going on or whether or not other sources actually may know something about you. So there's this whole kind of greenfields opportunity, which is this fraud discovery window, which is based on identity. The nice thing about that is there's a whole range of transactions where credit cards don't even turn up. So if I don't form a credit card payment and I'm somewhere like, at my school scheduling for my kids, then I still have an opportunity to catch fraud associated with the identity, even though there's no actual transaction at a credit card level. Just briefly to talk about this one. One of the things that's really fascinating about the identity ecosystem right at the moment is we actually have what I'm referring to at the moment as loose or asymmetric federations. So generally, you're all good bunnies and you've all federated your identities and you all know about the relationships and what it's like to build identity providers and operate federation mechanisms and all that sort of stuff, right? The challenge with all of the mechanisms we've talked about is that there is nothing from a trust framework agreement perspective that actually covers any of those. So if I actually create an account at a service provider and use an email provider address as part of the registration process, either for password resets or communication, does the email provider know about that? It's a completely asymmetric relationship. So there is no way to even understand from the email provider's perspective that they should even let the hundreds of thousands of companies that rely on that identity to know that they actually need to be able to be aware of the fact that somebody's taken over the email account and that some kind of signal should be provided. So that's kind of the aim of what we're up to here. Just in the last few minutes, I want to talk about the fact that we've actually just completed a proof of concept with some high assurance identity providers in the UK. Andy was actually involved. I'm sorry, Andy, you didn't get listed on the observer list. That was unfortunate. The concept here was these are commercial identity providers functioning in the context of the UK government. We had a couple of interesting use cases that were really, really different than the average one. The first one is there was this concept called registration velocity, where if I went to one of the 9 IDPs and I took the same information and tried to register at each of them, and I was a fraudster, what I could do is I could actually manipulate that information and retry it often enough at each of those locations that I might possibly be able to create a fraudulent account. How do you catch this? Well, in this case, what we did is we generated an alert and delivered a signal which said registration has failed, and if it's occurred frequently enough, then we actually have to raise the bar on how we deal with the process of registering a user. So we are handling basically the concept of registration velocity. The challenge is if I try to do this on a per IDP basis, there is no way to actually understand that this problem is even occurring, let alone catch it in time to do anything about it. The other one is account takeover. This is kind of a fairly regular one. But in this case, the magic here is that if I attack an account, take it over and take the profile information, I can now go to a different IDP with that same information and create a ghost account, effectively a replication of who I am at a different identity provider, still get access to my same tax records and social services payments, but nobody knows it exists. So the other use case that we deployed was an account takeover one where we actually notified the other IDPs. It was principally to address that kind of issue. There's a group of observers that were actually involved in that process. They're intending to be part of a second phase of deployment that we're hoping to kick off in the next month or two. What was really interesting about this is it was one of the first tests in a full-blown ecosystem using real providers, using real events that they declared were interesting to them. We looked at integration, what information had to be passed, how they could react to this sort of stuff. And there is an OIX report that you can find that was actually published just a couple of days ago, which will give you all of the details about how that process and stuff works. There is a risk working group as part of the Open Identity Foundation, which contains these and a few other folks who are looking at this generic problem of how do we do this in a standardized fashion. And the way that we're actually seeing this deploy at the moment is there are two kinds of levels. One is that there's kind of an internet-wide set of information that's useful. Everybody would like to know what's going on with Google's email address, for example. Within any particular set or small, we call them here in the US, kiddie pool, associated with a set of financial institutions or industry groups or whatever, it turns out there's also information which within there, if you were to share just really simple pieces of information, you can actually have a dramatic impact on the kinds of fraud or even just good health kinds of things. So what we demoed at the Cloud Identity Summit last year was password reset at an identity provider and then resetting sessions at all of the places you'd logged into. Part of the challenge is that in the identity world these days, revocation doesn't exist. The last thing I want to touch on in the last 30 seconds is this one. One of the questions that came up in the panel yesterday was, well, what happens around user notifications? And that's an interesting and long kind of question, and a lot of it has to do with how do I actually make sure that I'm informing the correct user rather than a fraudster that might be trying to attack me, for example. But then there's this other really fascinating opportunity, which is rather than relying on the identity providers and their risk evaluations, what if I came along and said, I just saw something that really worries me. Could I have all of my accounts suspended or the password reset or something else? And that's what we call the big red button use case. It's like, could we actually give consumers an opportunity to plug into the same kinds of systems so that they could actually influence the way that services actually behave in this environment? This has some requirements around it. You have to have a well-known environment, and you have to have strong authentication and a whole bunch of other things, and a separate channel of communication. But this is actually an opportunity for us to do some fairly interesting things. So I'm going to leave it there at this point. There's a whole lot of other things we could talk about. We've got 20-odd use cases that are fairly interesting in this space, but are there any questions at this point? Sure.
What do you mean by signal indicator?
Yeah, we didn't quite have enough time to get into like the nitty-gritty of this. The way that we describe it, what we define is a separation between the fact that there are events that are generated by authoritative sources, and then that's passed to a signal manager, and then the signal that's delivered is a transformed or some amount of processing has been done at a policy level to then guarantee that you get something that you care about. So for example, if I was a bank, I might care about what other banks want to say. I may not care about what social networks provide, for example. So I might want to apply filters as an example of the sort of policy we do.
So it means relationship to other entities.
It can do. What we're actually trying to do, though, is and so in the UK, the identity providers know each other. They have high level of trust. It's a different trust framework. In more general open internet activities, you actually want to hide the identities of the folks that are participating, but you still want to have some confidence level that it's a class of signals that you actually care about, for example.
So do you see the potential for this to actually informing the consumer? For example, the notices from Apple and Google and everything that my account has been used, a couple times I've panicked and realized it's my systems that are logging into other systems that are alerting, and so it could be confusing to a consumer.
And so what's the question, Debbie? I'm kind of...
So I'm wondering, will there be downstream notifications to consumers? I just think it may be overwhelming.
Again, this is part of what we're trying to come to understand right at the moment. The first issue is you have to have at least a second out-of-band kind of communication mechanism, at least for fraud events. Otherwise, you have the risk that you're actually informing the fraudster rather than the individual. And so trying to work out what state you're in is really, really hard. So if you can posit something like this, another way to communicate, then the question is, can you do it in a way that doesn't generate so much noise that we just do evil instead of good by trying to let them know? And we're right at the beginning of that. This is actually fairly hard. Stuff like online digital wallets, for example, seem to represent an interesting place you might be able to both manage and deliver this kind of information to as an external source. So we are testing some stuff with a couple of folks that do that digital wallet stuff. Anything else? Well, thank you for your attention. It's time for lunch, so I'm sure you're all chomping at the bit to get off there, but I appreciate your time. Thank you.